Oh, no.
Tall enough for this. This sounds pretty good. Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Are you having a good time thus far? Yeah. That's good. This is the 17th annual Satchmo SummerFest, presented by Chevron, who you'll note their logo is a chevron. It's true. It's just true. It's facts. It's facts. It's that thing. Anyway, the 2017 symposium is sponsored by the Ella Fitzgerald Charitable Foundation, the Joseph and Inez Eichenbaum Foundation, which is representatives here, Stephen Maitland-Lewis and Joni Berry, the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the Midlode Center at the University of New Orleans, Harrah's New Orleans, Richie and Vicky Nurigian, who are also around, you should thank them, the Fertel Foundation, and Bevelo Glass and Electric Lights. Next up, our first afternoon item for the Saturday, Trading Fours, Artistic Trends of Louis Armstrong and Romare Bearden. And it's Diedra Harris-Kelley, who is co-director of the Romare Bearden Foundation and a niece of Mr. Bearden, a painter herself. She is also an educator, an author, a curator of exhibitions, including a few at Jazz at Lincoln Center, including an exhibition of Louis Armstrong's collage works that she'll be talking about. And so making her initial appearance of, I hope, of many here at Satchmo SummerFest, give a warm New Orleans welcome to Ms. Diedra Harris-Kelley.
Hi there. Good morning. Well, good afternoon. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule, the food and the, music that's out there. I hope I will entertain you. And it'll be good. I want to start off, of course, thanking the organizers of Satchmo Fest, and particularly Fred Caston and Sabrina, who I don't know if she's in the room, but really, really impressed with all of her organizational skills to get us all here. A very special thanks to my friend Maxine Gordon, who is here also, who encouraged me to make a proposal. And I had a great adventure preparing this, and it's an honor to be among this year's participants and all of you who have come out to listen to us. I really enjoyed yesterday's presentation. I'm not sure if Matt Haben is here. Yes, Matt. Really enjoyed your presentation on the Brussels collage by Armstrong. It was very mysterious before you spoke on it. It unfolded like a mystery novel, your presentation, beginning with almost no clues, and then somehow leading to a trail of so much more information than we had before. So that's exciting. Hopefully it will be a book, because that's what we would like. For my presentation today, I want to focus on Armstrong's choice of collage as a method, and to explore the techniques generally as a beginning of what I hope will lead to a greater study. How many of you were here yesterday? Towards the end of the day, the last panel, the videos, that was unbelievable. Would you agree? Just to see Armstrong visually and to understand his method and performance, he is probably one of the greatest performing artists that I've ever seen. And Beyonce is included in that. I just want you to know I'm looking at the long scope of performers. In 2009, the book Satchmo, The Wonderful World and Art of Louis Armstrong by Steve Brower was published. I have a image of it here. It was a wonderful, wonderful book, and it was my introduction to Louis Armstrong as a visual artist. Until that time, I knew nothing of his work. And as part of a curatorial team at Jazz at Lincoln Center in New York, we were presented with this book as an idea for an exhibition. Really, the book is a biography. told as a picture book. So we didn't do the exhibition like that. Our idea was to just kind of focus on what it meant for him to be doing this kind of work and what it was, sort of introducing it to an audience that was very familiar with his music and not the visual side. We learned that early in the 50s, until he died in 1971, he produced these collage, and there are no dates. Most of the box tops don't even have dates about these works that are on the front, nor the information that's contained inside the boxes. Okay, so for some of you who were here yesterday and you're familiar with his collage, know that these works were built on boxes that were reel-to-reel tapes, right? 7-inch tapes, boxes, that Louis Armstrong had pre-recorded, because by the time he gets to doing the collage, it's many, many years in between the time that he's on the road making these recordings. And these recordings would be of himself playing, his band, interviews that he would make with other artists who were around, his friends and other celebrities. And then, and immediately my thinking was, of the iPods that we carry and we make recordings on, we have playlists and we add all our favorite music and travel with it, although he was traveling with a big case. Reel to reel at that time was a big, not your little disc players even. So he would make these tapes on the road and then play them also on the road, and then later went back and decorated the boxes. So we don't have dates for the images on the front, and they don't necessarily correlate with the inside information that's on the recording. So these are really, even though I like to see them as album covers, I like to think about that idea of art accompanying the music, but they really were decoration at that point because he wasn't really using them to illustrate what was inside. So this what, for some of you younger people who might not know what these boxes look like. I was fascinated with the shape of them because the square in art is something that's very alluring because it's like a unit. And so you can easily build up a surface using a very exact math of an object. So I was interested in that. And also, many of these collages were very similar to his scrapbook. So this is interesting because yesterday when Matt was giving his talk, and I'll show the collage that he referred to a little later, but it really was an anomaly, I think, among the works. We went to see these over 500 objects at the archive in Queens, the Louis Armstrong Archives, and it was fascinating because what we were looking at were objects that had not been preserved. So, if you take your typical scrapbook and, he was adhering things to the paper with Scotch tape, non-archival Scotch tape. There's no archival Scotch tape, first of all, just so you know. And the reason why it's not archival is because you can see it changes color, acid is introduced, it gets into the paper, and it gets pretty awful. But this brand that he's using actually, it attacks the paper in a way and attaches itself, but in many ways it was lifting. So these things became very, very fragile. And so when we did this exhibition, Let me see if I have, yeah. When we did this exhibition in 2009, we were not able to borrow any of the original works. So what we did get permission to do was to make beautiful reproductions. And many of them we produced larger than their actual size. So in a way, we had a benefit because if you look at a 7 by 7 inch box, and you're looking at the object, sometimes it's hard to see the detail. We have it blown up, and would be the size that we had some of them in the show. And so in that way, we actually got to highlight some of the details in the works. But we made some of them very large so that we could show the details through the tape, because what happened with the tape was that the tape separated from the paper and bubbled, and we'll see some where you can see where the tape then becomes an element, the coloring of the tape, and also the lines that are created from the tape and from the dust. So that became a different element. So we go to look at these things, and this, to me, as a visual person, as a painter, was one of the most fascinating things about these objects, because he was not trained as an artist. He wasn't trained in the proper materials to use, and he's using a product that was not made to last, but had a beautiful overall quality. I guess if you like this kind of thing, I mean, I really like the way that it was yellowed, and it would make the photographs a little foggy, a little furry. And so so that became just a fascination. And also the way that we had to handle them made them very precious little objects. And so that was wonderful. All right, so I don't want to get off my little program here, because I know I don't have time. And I have a way of going on and on, because I have a lot of information, so I want to get to it. All right. So I want to just go back really quickly to this one picture of Armstrong here. This is a picture of him at home, and where he was, he went from the scrapbooks to the tape boxes to the walls, and you can see the density of the objects that he adhered to the wall. And it's almost like a stream of consciousness on the way that these things are accumulated onto the wall, and some things fall off and they're torn, and it must have made for a beautiful, beautiful surface. Again, if you like that kind of thing as an artist, there's a certain emotional emotional thing that you get from seeing things that have been removed, and the torn paper. And I guess I should say that I am an artist, a visual artist. I'm a painter. And my interest in Louis Armstrong's collage work come from, this choice to use collage, which is a method that's just been persistent throughout art history. Right, and I'm sure he was aware of it. And yesterday, in the presentation with Matt, it's clear that he was actually that he knew artists, that he was hanging out with them, that there was no way that he was not aware of these things, even whether or not he was using them or thinking about them. I think that they were in his mind, and that he had developed a certain freedom of using this material. Now, we've all been using collage since we were in elementary school, I think, and we're so used to it as a method, because now if you use computers, if you write anything, if you do art, graphics, everything is a cut and paste. Even if you're just writing an email or a text, we're all very familiar with the cut and paste. And so it's this idea that collage was something that persisted throughout the 20th century, and that Louis Armstrong would pick this up was fascinating to me as an artist. Okay. Oops, are we working? Yeah. All right. So now most of the images you'll see are images where he used photographs of himself, lots of celebrities. He himself was quite the celebrity, as you all know, and interested in his own image. So, what I'm finding with most of these things are that he was attempting to represent his life. The other thing I should say is that, there's a certain pleasure in, he's not the first artist who would then move on to do other things visually and otherwise, because there were many artists, even Miles Davis did art. I know many of you know that. And there were many visual artists who were musicians, like if you're familiar with Larry Rivers, for one. Okay, I'm getting some nods, some no, but that's okay. And it's that kind of blurring of interest and techniques that they were using, and often trading even the language of visual and music off and on. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I like this idea that Louis Armstrong is someone who was at a very high level in his art. And I work for the Romare Bearden Foundation. And I've been steeped in the work of Romare Bearden, who is known as a visual artist, but also was very interested in music, interested in improvisational music, to be exact, and interested in the way that that music could influence his visual work. So, there is also much been said about Louis Armstrong's writing and his music and how it acts as a collage. The writing, if you've seen any of these journals and biographies that he's written and handwritten, and he also typed them out in a very distinctive green ink. And in this way, he was exploring the visual. When you look at these and you see the scratching out, if any of you are familiar with artists who print and then scratch, like a Basquiat, I'm trying to figure out what people are used to looking at. But if you look at this page and you see that that's something that we would have thrown away, perhaps, but he saved it, and researchers love to see this kind of thing because it shows the process. And so it's not a surprise that he would switch to doing some kind of visual work. So here's Louis Armstrong typing in backstage. And he was writing a lot of stories about his life. If you look at this page, it's a story about, I think I picked the right one, it's the story about barbershops in his hometown. And so he's written several biographies, autobiographies, and he's written a lot about his own life in his own words. So he's at a level as a celebrity, but yet he's looking at the way that he's being represented, and he's representing himself in many ways. So, like I said, the choice of collage is an interesting one, but it has been something that's persisted throughout 20th century art. And here we have sort of the beginnings of collage, early 20th century, that really shook up the way that we see space, the way that we see a surface, and the way paintings are made. Picasso and Braque are, credited with giving us cubism and really breaking the surface and breaking our idea of conventional art. If you think about the Italian Renaissance painters, it was really an obsession with space and looking the way that we see space, a naturalistic form. And that persisted for a long time. And then when Picasso and Braque started adding pre-existing elements, so that's newspapers, magazines, to their paintings, it was a bit of a shock. And what it was doing was bringing to the forefront the idea that this is a flat object. That, okay, it's not a window, we're not gonna see space the way we're used to seeing it. It's something flat, and it's something that, we can have expression, we can put expression on and not feel that it has to look exactly the way we're used to seeing things in space or light reacting. They were also very interested in time. So as some of you may know, with Cubism, you'd see things from many different perspectives, and that was a way of incorporating time. It's almost like walking around a person sitting in a chair, and you may see them from the front, and then you may see them from the side. And so that's a sort of element of time that's introduced to a stagnant, flat, two-dimensional surface. So, it starts with Cubism, and then many, many artists were influenced by it from there. This is a picture of Romare Bearden, African-American artist born in Charlotte, North Carolina, also a Southerner, also born in early part of the 20th century. He was born in 1911. So approximately 10 or 11 years, depending on which date you use for Louis Armstrong. And he came up from Charlotte with his family and to Pittsburgh for a little while, and then he ended up in New York. Pittsburgh was just a pit stop because his family, one of his grandmothers lived in Pittsburgh, and so he spent a year in 4th grade and then another year in high school. 2 years he graduated from Peabody in Pittsburgh, and there he starts to learn about the music even then, because he's in, Pittsburgh, which is a home to jazz, and he goes on later and does a piece on Mary Lou Williams. Anyway, so by the time he gets to Harlem, he is in the heyday of jazz, and he is living on 7th Avenue, not far from any of the clubs, and listening to music. He has a studio as a young man above the Apollo. He goes to NYU. Someone just mentioned NYU. He went to NYU and graduated and was interested in doing editorial cartooning and met the German expat George Gross. So we'll talk a little bit about George Gross a little later, but George Gross was very much involved in the Dada movement, which sort of comes after Cubism, after Futurism, but they're all involving themselves in collage, as you'll see. But this is one of the famous works by Romare Bearden, which is called The Block, and it's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you'll see here he talks about collage in a way of being able to see, this is actually a depiction of Lenox Avenue between 132nd and 133rd. And he describes this in his own words as a keyboard of sorts. And so what he's looking at is the music in the placement of the elements that you see. So the placement of color and the placement of shapes, creating a certain rhythm. And he goes on to develop this idea, and he even talks about the way that he places elements down on his compositions, and how it's sort of like an improvisational song or composition, where you put one thing down and then you sort of do a call and response, and you see what it's calling for, and you put another piece down, and you layer it that way, and you do that because you're interested in getting a certain rhythm or certain patterns throughout the work, and in that way he felt he was getting rhythm and movement. So it's, he took it to a high level, and he was very interested in listening to the notes between the notes. So it's sort of like in art, when we talk about, the positive shapes and the negative shapes are almost as important as the positive shapes. But many times we're trained to just sort of see the positive shapes, the figures. But if you think about how interesting the space around the figures are, it's sort of, dialectic in the sense that you can't have the positive without the negative shapes. So in music, he was listening to what those notes were, what those spaces were in between, the intervals between notes, and literally felt like that was a way of laying down different elements and creating rhythms visually. Very complicated. I can get up here and talk about it, but he gave us lots of words and thoughts about it. So if you're interested more, we can talk more about that. But generally, Romare Bearden was known to be the artist who represented African American culture and life in America. So he did subjects that were about the rural South. He did the urban North. Many of it was taken from his own life, his interest, music, and history. So here you have a piece that's called Farewell to Eugene. And this is a funeral for a little boy who was a friend of Bearden's that he credits with teaching him how to draw initially as kids. And he was crippled and passed away as a young kid. And so when Bearden is a mature artist and he turns to collage, it's sort of mid-career already for him. He's been through working in watercolor. He's worked as an abstract expressionist, doing abstract work completely, no figures. And then he moves into collage, which he's most known for in the mid-'60s. And in a sense, it's a return to the figure. You know, it's in the mid-'60s that he feels an urgency to create messages or to create something new from what we're looking at. So there was this idea that collage is a form where you're taking disparate parts and you're putting them together and making something new. And he felt like the times called for that we needed a new way to look at African American culture, a new way to look at African Americans, and a new way to look at ourselves as Americans or as global beings. So he was very much interested in this idea of a universal principle that comes through a diverse people. So this is why many people talk about his work like it's cutting up and fragmenting, and you'll see in a piece like this, it's fragmented, but his intention was to bring things together. So he was more interested not in the fragmentation of people, but in the building and hybridity of people. So that's something that a lot of folks don't quite get right with his work. You'll see some of his work on a lot of the covers of magazines and newspapers in the mid-'60s. Time magazine, Fortune magazine. He did a lot of Crisis magazine. He started off as a cartoonist for the Afro-American in Baltimore. And there he was, not in the service of the story, he was creating the story. So his cartoons would be standalone editorials. And I don't think I brought any cartoons, but I wanted to talk about his collage work. So this is an album cover for Billie Holiday's original recordings. And you'll see here where he's using reproduced papers. So we'll go back and we'll talk about how Louis Armstrong is using a lot of his own photographs that he takes or that others take. He's taking from the newspaper, magazines. So this would be pre-printed pieces and existing elements. That's what I meant by, Picasso using existing elements that are in the world. Lots of times, it's everyday objects that we're familiar with. So as collage starts to move, of course, artists are using things from their own lives and bringing them into the work. This is a series that Romare was working on with two other artists, a photographer, Sam Shaw, and with a writer, Albert Murray. Anybody familiar with Albert Murray? Yeah. All right. Oh, very nice. And so this was intended to be a book. Unfortunately, it never became a book because they all had a falling out, and we don't know. There's lots of stories. There's, artists working together. Sometimes it's a good collaboration, sometimes it's not. And Romare did a lot of collaborations with other artists, with Sam Shaw. He also worked on a film project, 2 film projects with Sam Shaw. One was Gloria, the film that, the John Cassavetes film, where Bearden was asked to do the intro visuals for the city. And so I think I had one in here. This was one from that series that he, so these would be the intro, and then they would show live footage of the city. So it sort of melded in to that. So he was very good at the collaborations, but this was just one collaboration that didn't work, unfortunately. So we did an exhibition of these works called Paris Blues. And so we recreated, or tried to recreate it as a book on the wall. And so you'll see here, Bearden's using some of the photographs from the film that Sam Shaw was the art producer on, called Paris Blues. Anybody know that film? Okay. And so their idea was to then make a book about African-American jazz musicians in Paris. And so Albert Murray was going to write the story, Bearden would do the pictures, and he would incorporate some of the photographs that Sam Shaw took while he was an art producer on the film, or art production person on the film. And so, it's in a way somewhat illustrative, but it's very much like the way that Louis Armstrong used his elements, because he's using famous people. And this is the wonderful thing about collage, and this is why it's such an easy method to pick up, is because, one, you don't have to know how to draw Ellington, right? Like, you want Ellington in your picture, you don't have to know how to draw him. And then there's a certain association with that picture and with those people, and then when you put it with the Mona Lisa, you get another thing that vibrates. And then when you draw certain elements that are very recognizable, like the Eiffel Tower, so you get all of these things sort of vibrating together to mean something new in the piece. So that's sort of the basics of collage. And the reason why I think we've persisted with it for so long is because you discover that that's what our world is like. That's what our lives are like. That it's a way of retelling history. It's a way of disrupting conventions. It's a way of bringing new ideas in that aren't visual yet, right? So this is another work by Bearden that shows how involved he was with these early ideas of Cubism. He was a follower of Picasso. He loved Matisse. He went on to study art. He was a lifelong student of art history. And he was pulling from many different areas and bringing them into his work. So he goes on later in life and does a series called The Odyssey, where he takes the story, the Homer story, and he makes all of the characters black. So in that way, you're getting the story of Homer that we're familiar with, and then you're seeing them as black characters, and so then they begin to vibrate and become something new. So you look at this story in a different way. It's a universal story that we're all used to, a man trying to find his way, or man or woman trying to find their way home, right? This long odyssey. And then you think, well, what if it were Africa? What if it were the Caribbean? And he does it with bright colors. And so in that way, he's bringing it together and creating something new. So he comes to Harlem. He's very involved in the music. Ellington is a distant cousin. he comes to one of his early shows and buys a piece of work. So he's kind of in this milieu. His mother is the New York correspondent for the Chicago Defender. So she's sort of a mover and shaker in New York and brings a lot of this music and the musicians and poets and writers into Bearden's life. And so it's a very rich, layered life. And of course, Louis Armstrong was one of his favorites, and he shows up in quite a bit of his work. That's him there in the right-hand corner, very much in the vein of the way Louis Armstrong might introduce famous people into his work, or his friends into his work. And Bearden adds an element. He's got the African mask there vibrating. I say vibrating because I like the way these elements start to work together in our mind. So there's another work that features Louis Armstrong. And Bearden goes a little step further because of his involvement in sort of formal characteristics of art. And you see these stripes and these little, it's like bars of color in the same way that he's trying to find the rhythm and trying to actually make it into planes that, again, accentuate the flatness of the work. But also keep in mind, this is from the Paris Blues series. And so it's a type of illustration of his ideas for the book. A piece that features Ellington, Bessie Smith. So you see these elements that he cuts and pastes, but then you also see the elements of the colors and the shapes that he integrates. And this is a way of integrating the material. So, you know, there are times when Bearden was only using reproduced papers, and then he moved into using colored painted papers. And then in his high style, towards the end of his life, he was then going in and painting into it. So there were a lot of different things going on. He was grabbing at these elements and really fitting them into the composition in an artistic way that was hoping for the result of a harmony of these elements. So, you know, when we think about Louis Armstrong, it's not my intention to compare him to visual artists who practice and who are interested in these other layers. And I'm not even saying that he wasn't interested in these other layers. But Bearden was interested in having a conversation with modern art. He was interested in seeing how he can take these forms and these techniques and methods and use them to describe his own life and what he was familiar with, because he felt like it was a way, he saw those universals. It was a way of communicate. It was a language that he wanted to use. Okay, let me move a little faster here. This is also Bearden abstract work, and this, a little commercial break right here, because this is a work that is in that vein that I mentioned, that purely abstract, but it's a collage. It's a collage of canvas on board. And so when I said earlier that Bearden started collage in the mid-century, sort of mid-career also, he actually was doing a little bit of collage, but it's not recognized in the same way. He's more famous for that mid-century work that he did. Oh, but the commercial break was that they are having an exhibition opening of his abstract works up at SUNY Purchase in New York. It's the Neuberger Museum in September. So we're all very excited about that, because this is not what people are used to seeing. And as a foundation, of course, perpetuating his legacy, this is the kind of thing we want to encourage people to look at an artist in a full way. And so many people will look at this and say they don't like it because it's not what they're familiar with. So it's our job to explain how this fits into his larger oeuvre of his work. So I'm just going to move a little bit quicker here. This is the cover for a song that Romare Bearden was part of a songwriter on. So like Louis Armstrong decides he's going to do collage. Many artists go on and do other things. Well, Romare Bearden went to Paris in 1950 and had a really good time. He did no work, no painting. He went to study at the Sorbonne. He was studying philosophy. And he says, he was just soaking up the atmosphere, the art, meeting artists, meeting other Americans that were there. And when he came home, he wanted to go back. So he thought to himself, how can I make some money? Like, literally, I'm an artist. There's something I can do to make money. And he's involved in jazz and decides that he, has some poetry, because he does also write, and he makes songs. Now, if you listen to a lot of them, so he was my uncle. He was married to my mother's sister, so I can say this, I think, that I'm so glad he stayed with his art and really pursued the visual. Some of his songs are great, but they're flowery. Like his poetry was very flowery. And so the words to this song are very corny. But 1954, Billy Eckstine does it, and he rocks it. So I remember when I first realized that Romare was involved in music this way, or that he picked it up in a sort of way that seems like he's not staying in his lane. I thought to myself, well, that makes sense, because an artist at a high level really doesn't see those lines necessarily, those lanes, and could pick it up and probably do pretty well at it, because a lot of the skill that it takes, the discipline, the focus, the contacts, whatever it is, are there, and they can rely on that. They can pull on that. So it's impressed me as a young artist who can, barely stay in my lane and do that well. So I'm always impressed with how artists can find their way and do other things. But flowery. Flowery language. All right. So here's another jazz work by Bearden. Again, he moves from reproduced papers to a point where he's using mostly colored paper, and then he incorporates them. So this is just an example. Also an example of, sort of shifting scales, which is something that Louis Armstrong does sometimes accidentally, I think, but sometimes because it works, where, you have this idea of this push and pull of this plane, right? And so how do you represent distance in a two-dimensional form? Okay, not to get too technical, because most of us look at art and you just know something that looks good. You know what you like, right? You know what gives you, an emotional response. You know what looks like. You know the difference between what the Renaissance artists were trying to portray and what abstract artists did. And sometimes you get the same effect. Like if you make objects smaller on a two-dimensional surface, they appear to be further away. Right? So those were the things that Bearden was using when he was moving on to this. So you see a lot of shifting planes, like those dancers look like they are way above, they're huge in the front. And in this way, he's kind of giving an element of time, like you're seeing them close up and far away at the same time. So those were some of his engagements with Cubism. Also, you see he'll have objects that are much larger in the space, like the figure on the left's hand is huge. And so that was about emphasis. That was also about how your eye moves around the space. So he was involved in all of that. So for him, it was just another layer. It was a conversation with artists. It was a conversation with art. And at the same time, he's having a conversation with people who are relating to the story, because he's a storyteller, much like Louis Armstrong, but really wanting to tell his story of growing up in the South, when he does work like this is a work from Pittsburgh, from the Pittsburgh series. When he does this work, it's way in the 70s. He's migrated, from the South when he was 3 with his family. So he goes back in his memory. Most of his work is about his memory, going back and trying to capture what he sees is fast, quickly disappearing. So then I'm looking at Louis Armstrong and I'm saying, okay, what is his motivation in his art? Because that's what you're trained to do when you're an artist, right? You think, what am I looking at? How is it made? And what are the motivations, for the artist? And I felt like there were several areas that Louis Armstrong that I could group his works in. And one of the areas was sort of the very graphic elements. Some of it was him capturing his history and his own identity. And some of it was him engaging with those covers, right? So quickly go through a little bit of the other artists who've used collage. George Gross, we're talking about the early teens. Hannah Hock, German artist. We move into the Dada era of the Dada, and I don't want to get too technical. These are, just movements in art where they were using collage. Almost every period after Picasso, after Cubism, you will find a group of those artists using forms of collage. Some of them were blending them. Some of them, the surrealists, were using the idea of collage, but to make something that looked like it was plausible, right? So in some of these early collage, they're mixing it up. They're breaking up the space. You don't really recognize some of these forms, right? They're not plausible. But Magritte was very interested in making things look like it was possible to happen, the surrealist. So you have reality, and then you have something that's super, and that's where you get, surrealism. Kurt Schwitters, now he is very much in the vein of the earlier modernist. Duchamp, I know you recognize that name, Duchamp, is then using things from everyday life and bringing them out into 3 dimensions. So you get sculptural objects or objects that are now considered sculptural and considered art. So he was like, anything can be art, right? And next to that is a postcard where he took the Mona Lisa and he put a mustache on her. And this is a postcard. So he takes someone else's art and he makes his own art out of it. So that's another way of collaging and things together. Here's Dali. Many of you familiar with Dali. Joseph Cornell. Joseph Cornell was an artist who was very, very interested. Now, if you see on the right, this is a box. This is very sculptural. It kind of moves away from 2 dimensions, but when you see it in the depiction as a photograph, it looks flat. But it's actually a box. He did shadow boxes, and he would bring all of these elements together in a very poetic way. Most of them did not make sense. He had a very sort of personal language that you don't necessarily get. You don't exactly know how all the parts come together, but he was after harmony, so that was another layer that he would build in, a certain harmony and certain emotional charge from putting objects together. Okay, Robert Rauschenberg, very familiar with that. He got involved with printmaking, and then he would also bring objects and stick them onto the canvas. So big objects that would then come into the space. So then you had all this dialogue about whether or not it was really art. It's not flat, it's not a painting, it's not on the wall, it's now in the space. So those are some of the Okay, there are no art historians in the room, right? I hope. Okay, some of the stupid arguments that artists have about high and low, what's art, what's not art. And so when I look at Louis Armstrong and I say that, you know, I don't want to compare him with fine artists, it's only because I don't feel like his intentions or that we need to put those layers onto his work or those demands onto his work, because those may not have been his intentions. His intentions were about pleasure, was about capturing who he was. Okay, they're giving me the signal here. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through some of the other African Americans who were doing work. This was Bearden, and here we have Betty Saw. For those of you familiar with her, on the right is her. This is called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. So the idea of collage, the way that she used it, was she was bringing in stereotypes, right? And so they're vibrating in a certain way that we're familiar with, and then she likes to turn them on their heads. So the mammy figure here has a rifle in her hand. So in that way, you're vibrating and you're changing the way we think about Aunt Jemima. You're changing the way the central figure is a big woman, but she's not a mammy. So that, you know, so you have the objects that vibrate, but also the artist's intention that becomes part of that mix. Okay, and we haven't even gotten to Louis Armstrong. So these are other artists who did confines. Some other, I wanted to talk about the African American tradition with collage and bricolage, because how do you talk about an experience without using figures? Because that's complicated, right? And so Noah Purifoy was also interested in using the detritus of life. So using materials that were part of his everyday, part of the trash. And so that's the tradition of making something out of nothing, literally. So Louis Armstrong in his home, letting his collage really live and breathe and grow. Yeah. This is a great photograph because look at his involvement. Look how he becomes inside of that art. It's an installation, early installation. All right, so quickly, a couple of different ways of looking, and I haven't stuck to my list here, but you'll be happy that I did not, because it would have bored you. Okay, so the first thing I think about is the ones that are graphically driven. So you think about some of the early Picasso works that I showed and how they introduced text to paintings and text to art. That was not something that the Renaissance artists, the Impressionists, they were not interested in text. What did that have to do with space and our lives? And so then it opened the floodgates for people to add content into their work besides the label or the title of the work. And so you have several of these from Louis that are using just text. This is actually a list of song titles. And so it's almost like an album cover in a sense, because you think that might be what's inside and the way that he would list it. But many of them were things that he ripped from the headlines about himself. And so this is why I talk about the representing of his image in his own way, in his own voice. So it's sort of like highlighting we do on a page, right? You highlight what you like. I'm sure he was getting to the good parts of the article and making those stand out so he could say that they got that right. Maybe he was criticizing them, or he was doing his own kind of art criticism, literary criticism. Or you have him taking pieces of things that are meaningful to him, like greeting cards, and cutting them up, cutting the words out, and representing them. So this is a card that said, "To my dear, lovely wife, happy Valentine's Day." But then I'm sure that that card said what it needed to say, but he either wanted to preserve it or he wanted to restate it. And so he captured it on this collage with lots of tape, lots of Scotch tape. So, you know, in a way, you get this patina. You know, you get an old sort of look to it, and it yellows it, and it makes you think, it gives that emotional, charge that this is something old and precious. You know, here's, the inclusion of Swiss Chris that we've all heard about, his love for that product. And so it's no surprise that it would show up in his collage. He probably had tons of the material around, and right. And here, the tape really gives you an almost, if you're looking at it through an artist's eye, you think, oh, wow, look at how the tape cuts her face in half and kind of creates this idea that maybe she's two different people, or it's two different times, or, she's older, or she's a person of color. It's just, just some fun thing you might think about. Here, he takes a picture from a family event and then writes a caption for it. So it's sort of like he's writing his, his scrapbook. Okay, guys, I know, I see them getting together in the back. They're trying to figure out how to shut me up. Okay, so I want to continue. And so then you get a segment of his work that is very much like the scrapbooks, where he's kind of exploding those greeting cards, and he's adding captions under he's almost writing these little articles and ads. They're like ads for Louis Armstrong's life. But it also is a way to capture his interests and his ideas. It's a way that a lot of artists work, where they will tape up things that inspire them so they can keep them in the forefront of their memory as they're working. So things that inspire you, you save. And this was his way of putting them together in an interesting way. Again, the tape has a central spot here where it's creating boxes and shapes. Okay, I'm going through fast. Okay, this is an album cover that he did not do, but is done in the style of Louis Armstrong's collage, in a way, right? So he's engaging with that. So then you get this sort of more poetry that he adds in when he's making different kinds of decisions. So it's not just about the scrapbook, I'm going to put the image here, I'm going to give it a caption. He actually says, okay, I'm going to put 4 heads and have them like satellites going around and around. And, it's funny. It's funny to see, maybe Louis Armstrong sees himself as a whole band. Maybe he sees himself as being in these different spots at different times. Here, every time I look at this, I think about a nun that he's got. It's purely just because of the shape that's created from his interaction with the box top. Okay, here he covers it with tape first. That's the background, and then he adds in the figures, and he's cutting and pasting and creating a little story within that. Okay, one more minute. Swiss Chris, star, and below, I believe we have Velma. Is that Velma? Yeah. So let me just point out quickly that these words, real, 7-6, 3-3-4, we're assuming that they have nothing to do with the art, but they become part of the art. He doesn't remove it. He doesn't try to erase it. He doesn't try to cover it up. So it begins to interact in a way that vibrates with the work and is meaningful. We can assume meaning, but we wouldn't know what it is. Here's the Brussels collage, in case anyone missed that yesterday. Very much engaging beyond just, his own life, and beyond just showing photographs that relate to people and celebrity, his own life. This is much more Louis Armstrong as artist, creating art. And here, some of the things that may seem accidental, create very, rhythmic structure. Trying to see what I'm saying is with the arch of the Eiffel Tower that we're all familiar with, even though we're only seeing the bottom of it, we know that's the Eiffel Tower. And then he's actually using or letting some of the color from the box top, which is green, come through. So he's working with all of that. Here, he uses that little fairy, figure there to tell a story, and he puts that figure inside the circle form and allows us to see the text. So in that way, it's accidental. Yes, I'm finishing up right now. I love all of these, and I didn't go fast enough, sorry. Internet, again, here, this lily figure, this flower, is plopped right in the middle of the reel, and it almost looks like it's floating in water. Okay, and then that ends with another picture of the collage on the wall. Thank you very much for listening and indulging me.
Diedra Harris-Kelley, and I don't know if you got a chance to mention it, but as part of Prospect 4, the New Orleans Art Biennial, it opens November the 17th, I believe. In this building, the Louis Armstrong House Museum is lending 30 of the collages.
Right.
And so they'll be on view until February 25th of 2018 as part
right.
of it.
And these are the collages that we were not able to borrow, but they've been conserved. And so now they can travel. So it's a real treat to see them in person. Thank you very much.
All right, Diedra Harris-Kelley. And coming up next, Louis Armstrong as music critic with John Swenson. We'll be right back.
Good.
Always a pleasure. You want to use your own device?